Everybody, welcome. Thanks for coming along to hear me witter for a few minutes. It's brilliant to be able to do this. I don't want this to be one way, especially as we're quite a small but perfectly formed group. So I want it to be a chat as much as anything else. And Kaskar, I know you've got some thoughts as well. So my name's Dave Howard. I'll introduce myself a bit more fully in a bit, but I did want to sort of start this whole session by disappointing you. There is no silver bullet when it comes to podcast marketing. There is no, if you do this, that will fix your problem solution. It is 1,000 tiny levers and tiny pushes and things that you can do. And inevitably, you won't be able to do all of them. And I think it's about having quite a savvy approach to what is available to you in the time that you have available to you and the resource that you have, kind of what's going on around you, thinking a bit about your audience and what their needs are. And the other thing I would say from the outset is that you, as podcasters, you will have access to the audience data, so the listeners that you have. And so when you are doing things that, to market your podcast, keep a close eye on the data as you're doing it, so you can over time get a real sense for what is moving the dial and what isn't. So that's my kind of sort of introductory salvo. Just to back up a little bit and tell you a bit about me, that was me about 20 years ago when I first joined the BBC as like a junior reporter. I was BBC Hereford and Worcester, and I spent my whole career in the BBC. I sort of worked my way from there through to Radio 1. I was Radio 1 Newsbeat's politics reporter for a long time. I've made a lot of documentaries for Radio 4, and we've just delivered a documentary to the BBC World Service this morning. So my whole career really has been in audio and in journalism, radio journalism. But of course, podcasting is something that it's been around for quite a long time, but really sort of got rocket boosters under it in the last little while. So it was January 2020 that I decided to leave the BBC and sort of set up Bespoken Media as a podcast. Well, the grand word, I mean, it's not as grand as Story Weaver, but the grand word for us is we're a consultancy, essentially. So we work with brands and communities and organizations to help people tell their own stories through audio. And the thing I always say to people when I'm talking about audio, people say, why audio? Why radio? And the fact of the matter is it's the most intimate medium of storytelling. I think the real benchmark of success with audio storytelling, kind of less so, I guess, since the pandemic, because people are doing less driving. But if people have got where they're going in the car and your audio story hasn't finished yet, you want them to stay sitting in the car until they've finished listening. You want them to be riveted because they want to find out what happens at the end. That's the kind of benchmark, I think, of really good kind of audio stories. It needs to mean something to them. And that's what I think we're always striving for when we're making something in audio for an audience. So I'm leading by example here, guys, and just saying to you that, part of this work is by hook or by crook. So one of the things that we make is one of the things that Bespoken makes is a climate change podcast called Local Zero, which is about sort of community and local action to listen to climate, to respond to climate change. We make that with Strathclyde University. I'd love you to add that to your sort of list of things that you make. And the reason I say that up front is that, that's part and parcel of what we're doing when we're marketing a podcast is we're shouting about it. We're letting people know. We're not hiding our light under a bushel. Similarly, we run something called the Scotland Audio Network here at Bespoken, which is essentially just a community of audio producers, which kind of shares ideas and thoughts and kind of, there's little sort of mini mentory relationships that go on in there, and people sort of come to us with ideas, and Nico would be a great place to find out people's advice about what kit to purchase and things like that. So, I'm trying to lead by example by telling you about some of the stuff that we do. And my computer's not. There you go. There we are. So I wanted to whistle through these stats really quickly because they tell a general overview about podcasting generally, but also I think it's quite pertinent to marketing. There are, and I think this number's gone up again, but as of April 2022, there were 2.4 million active podcasts on Apple Podcasts. Somebody told me the other day it's closer to 4 million now. It was 550,000 in 2018. So, it's going like a rocket ship, the numbers of podcasts that are out there. And, it goes without saying that the most popular podcasts are entertaining. They're often comedy and personality talk shows. The reason I say that is that, your podcasts aren't necessarily primarily going to be entertainment podcasts. They're not there. Their first order of duty isn't to make people laugh or, be fun for folks. But I think they have to also do that in order to win people over. They have to be interesting. They have to be something that your audience wants to listen to. And the other very quick point to make is that while there are more podcast listeners out there at the moment, you are in an extraordinarily competitive space. The podcast that you make is competing with literally millions of other podcasts, and not just podcasts either. It's competing with the radio, it's competing with music artists, it's competing with just going for a walk. Yeah. So you have to, it's not like the radio. I used to work on Newsbeat, which was the news offering on Radio 1 aimed at kind of youth audiences. And we were on sort of between 12:45 and 1 o'clock between two of the big DJs. And the only challenge that we had was to be good enough to make people not want to switch off, which is, in the context of podcasting, a completely luxurious position to be in. If you start your podcast with 4.5 million listeners, and all you have to do is make sure that not many of them switch off, then, just imagine how amazing that would be in terms of our kind of reach and our ability to reach people. We don't have that. Our podcasts start with 0 listeners, and every single conversion that we make is somebody new who has chosen to take a chance on us, on our work, on what we offer. They have, and actually that's why we should kind of treasure and covet every single listener that we have, because they have chosen to spend time with us and our product. And I don't know where you've got your little window with all our faces in, but if you move it to the right of your screen, you'll see this. I think it's a guy. I'm pretty sure it's a guy anyway, staring out of the window here with their headphones on. I just hit me with some thoughts about this person. What is obvious about this person from what we're seeing? What are they doing and how are they doing it?
He looks like he's in V&A in Dundee. That's what it looks like to me.
Oh, I didn't mean specifics of location.
I know, but that was my first thought. Sorry, David.
It just makes the point that podcast listening is very, very intimate. Okay, so there's a statistic that 70% of people who start to listen to a podcast will listen to it through to the end of the episode. So 70% of people who start I've mangled that stat completely. 70% of people who start a podcast will complete the podcast. So, if you're thinking about that in marketing terms, in terms of the messages that you're giving to folks, well, let's say you put something out on Twitter, or you make an Instagram post or a TikTok reel or something like that. Let's say it gets 1,500, 2,000 views, something like that. That's 2,000 people that have had quite a slight, light touch engagement with your brand and with your message. If you've got 50 people who choose, and I'm using a deliberately quite low number there, if you've got 50 people who choose to spend time with your podcast for 25 to 40 minutes, that's a much deeper engagement. So those people are spending a considerable amount of time with your brand and with your message. And that's not to be sniffed at. Okay, so I know, Nico, when you came on, you said, I haven't got enough listeners. I'd like more listeners to my podcast. Each and every one of those listeners is somebody who is choosing to spend a considerable amount of time with your brand and your message. So, the starting point is that if you've even got a few listeners in podcasting, you're heading in the right direction, and it's kind of onwards and upwards from there. So I want to start by giving you that kind of injection of, actually, we're doing not too badly. And I'll return to audience numbers and stats and things in a little bit. But listen, just opening things out to you again. We need to be quite quick because we want to try and get finished at 2. So what would encourage you, and just fire these back at me, what would encourage you to listen to a particular podcast? Why would you listen to a particular podcast? Just fire some answers back at me. Really, some of them are really obvious. But
recommendations. Sorry.
Recommendations. What did you say, Pete?
If it's engaging, if it's
engaging. Yeah, right. Is it good? Is it good? Is it worth listening to? Yeah.
For me, I think things that matters in my community and to myself.
So like in your niche, right? So like the things that particularly interest you. And that's a beautiful thing about podcasting, is that you can be quite specific in the things that you're talking about. Although, to go back to Hazel's point, how do you reach the people that aren't interested in that stuff, which is something we should return to. Okay, look, that's great. Actually, I've given this 5 minutes, but is it good? Is it engaging? And then Katie earlier said recommendations. So I think lesson 1 or rule 1 of how to market your podcast is it's got to be good. You have to have a quality product to market in the first place. If people come to your podcast, even if they think it's interesting and it's a subject area that they like, if it's badly recorded, if it's waffly, if the first 90 seconds are somebody said to me once, what do you do for a living? And I said, I make podcasts. And they said, oh God. And I said, what? He said, I hate podcasts. Why do you hate podcasts? It's just blokes talking, right? And that just says to me that they've had some bad experiences with bad podcasts, right? You need to figure out how to engage your audience. And because bear in mind, they have taken a chance on you from the outset. So the first 30, 60, 90 seconds of your podcast has to be completely golden. So whatever else you do, make sure that first opening element is A, representative of what they will find in your podcast, and B, gives them no excuses to switch off and do something else. Once you've got them there, you want to keep them. And all of this work, and lots of things I'm going to talk about over the next half hour, needs to be done up front. This is strategy, it's planning, it's format development. It's not, right, I've recorded some stuff, how am I going to get it out there? It's all got to be done right from the outset. From the very conception of your podcast, you're building in not just the creation of it, but the marketing and the distribution of it. How are you going to reach people? How are you going to build your community? And you're also building in how will you respond to the statistics as well. So you're looking at your audience data and figuring out what you'll tweak as a result of that. So here's another question for you. Katie went straight in there with recommendation. Recommendation is the single most powerful tool for getting bigger audiences. If you can get people out there in the world to recommend your podcast to the people in their peer group, that is like absolutely the best way to get more listeners, is to encourage people to do that. So just again, thinking about yourselves as podcast listeners rather than podcast creators, what would incentivize you to recommend a podcast?
If I feel like I've heard a new idea or something that kind of clicks in my mind. Great.
I'm going to write some of these down. Any more?
If it makes you want to listen again. So at the end of it, if you're wanting to either get the next episode right away, or if you're wanting to book time to get it.
Yeah. There's all sorts of chat about social capital. Sometimes we recommend things to people because we want to be associated with it ourselves. So there's an element of that, as a sort of psychology to that as well. But again, it goes back to, it's got to be good. I heard this brilliant. Nobody ever says I heard this. I heard this mediocre podcast that was recorded quite badly on shit microphones on Zoom. But I think you should listen to it, even though it's rubbish. Yeah, I heard this brilliant podcast. Beautifully made, lovely sound design, really nicely crafted. I think you should listen to it. Like, that's a much more obvious sort of. So I'm ramming this point home, but the first thing about marketing your podcast is make a good podcast. And then the second rule is 50% of the work of making a good podcast is marketing the podcast. For the reason I said to you earlier, if it's on the radio, you start with listeners. If it's a podcast, you start with 0 listeners. So we're gonna talk about some of the ways, and again, so I'm assuming for the rest of this sort of time that you have an absolutely spanking podcast that meets the needs of your audience perfectly. Okay, so from this point on, that's the assumption that we're making, is that you've done all the groundwork that delivers an excellent podcast. So then how are you going to get it out there to people? How are you going to grow audiences? How are you going to build your community? And there's some very obvious things that you can do. If you've got a budget, you can get assets out on social media. You can pay for adverts, whether that's in newspapers, newsletters, in other podcasts. One thing that I think it's very important to recognize is that it's much easier to convert people to listen to your podcast if they already listen to podcasts. So there are plenty of people out there who don't know what a podcast is or don't listen to podcasts. That's maybe not the first place to start when it comes to getting new people to listen to your podcast. I'm not going to dwell on this slide because, paid marketing is paid marketing. It's probably not where most of us are, and certainly isn't why you've come along to today's session for me to tell you, oh, you could pay Facebook money to advertise your podcast. That's not what we're here for. I had that silver bullet at the beginning, and I make that point that there is no silver bullet. We've talked about this already. Make a good product. Start with the needs of your audience. Figure out what they would benefit from, and work from there. And we might get a chance to talk about like specifics of some of your projects if I rattle through these slides quite quickly before the end of the hour. Just so picking things out at random to kind of focus on. Everybody actually does judge a book by its cover, unfortunately. So, assuming that, as I said, I've assumed that you've got a beautiful podcast and lovely sound design, and you've got it hosted on a platform that gets it out to people. You then need to think about your cover art, and it needs to stand out. It needs to capture people's imagination, even quite a small size, thumbnail size. So again, much like I said about the sound design and the first 60, 90 seconds of your podcast, it has to be excellent, and it has to convey the meaning of your podcast. There are ways to do this work inexpensively. You can just do it on Canva or something. If you have got a budget, it is worth finding a graphic designer to spend a bit of time working up ideas for your podcast. Do stop me at any time if you've got questions, but I'm going to rattle on. Is everybody who's making podcasts at the moment familiar with audiograms? An audiogram is, if you're not familiar with the name, you will have seen them in your social feed. It is quite simply a visual asset that you can add to a tweet or a social post, an Instagram post, LinkedIn, whatever it might be, that has a little clip of your podcast. So this is a podcast that we make called On Farm. So you can see the subtitles at the bottom there. You can see the waveform. It's got our brand on it. This is actually a really simple, rudimentary one made. I'm going to stop him talking about farming for now, but it's just a very, very simple way to inhabit real estate in people's social feeds. Okay, so just have your you can just create these very easily as MP4s and attach them to tweets. It's just a visual way to share and get stuff out there. It isn't enough just to stick it on your own social feeds, though. You want to try and get as many others to do that as well. So I think what we're starting to think about here is your production workflow. Okay, so building into the workflow that you have, not just creating the episode and getting it out there. When you're editing your podcast, have half an ear for those kind of nuggets, those sort of 35, 40-second nuggets that can be lifted and will work out of context as audiogram clips. I'm my own worst enemy in that I'm not very good at multitasking. So I'm usually somebody who will create the episode and then go, oh God, I completely forgot to sort the audiogram, and I'll have to go back and listen through it all again and do it afterwards. But if you're smart and you can do it as you're going, you're not actually creating extra work for yourself. You're just taking the clip out as you're editing it. And then you need to make sure that it's not just you that's sharing that audiogram. You know, I said at the very beginning, it's by hook or by crook. It's finding every opportunity you can, moving every lever that you can to get these messages that you have, these important messages that you have in front of the people that matter. So when I say team members, not all of you will be working with teams particularly, but you'll be working certainly with, broader communities. So make sure that you can spoon feed. So when you created this MP4 audiogram, for instance, email it to people with a line that says, here's a template tweet. I'd love you to share this tweet. Email it to the people that you interview in your podcast. Make sure that the umbrella organization that you work with is sharing it to their communities. I'm sure if you're involved in the how do we say it, Casca? Is it SC CAN? Or is it just SCAN? What do you say?
Scan.
Just SCAN, yeah.
I'm sure used to be Scottish communities CAN, but we're moving away from that.
SCAN, yeah. I'm sure, and actually one of the things that Casca and I were talking about before this session is, could we build a kind of a hub, like a podcast showcase hub? Because if there's various people around Scotland that are making their own kind of disparate podcasts, it can be quite hard to get people to find those. So maybe Casca's SCAN organization can amplify and kind of bang the drum for some of the sort of various smaller podcasts that are out there. We can talk about that afterwards. But yes, basically, part of your workflow is making sure that everybody involved in your podcast spoon feed them. Make sure that they've got, with just a few clicks, the ability to amplify your voice, share it to their network. You'll have a think as well about, because all of the things that I'm telling you are quite disparate, and there's lots of different sort of things that you could do. Time is kind of the premium thing here, so you won't be able to do all of them. All of these things that I'm saying to you, run it through the sort of filter of, will that work for my audience? And if you don't think so, don't do that one. Okay. You might want to pick kind of, if I'm sharing sort of 13, 14, 15 tips with you over the course of this hour, you might want to start with just 3 or 4 that you think are quite easy for you to implement. And then maybe sort of, swap those out and swap others in, because, it would be a full-time job for a marketing assistant to do all of these things all at once. But there are things you can start to do that are quite savvy. So for example, if you have an active Facebook page or an active LinkedIn page, turn the banner of your Facebook page into a promo for your podcast. It's free space online. Similarly, auto signatures on emails that you send to people. Okay. All of this is kind of just trying to be more savvy about the word that I would use is online real estate that you have. Stick a little logo in your banner. Be quite shameless. Have a separate sort of Facebook page, which is to promote the podcast, because I think you don't want to blur the boundaries too much between your kind of private social media and what you use for business purposes, if you like. Is everyone here familiar with Podfollow? So Podfollow is really useful. If you just go to, I think it's Podfollow. Hang on, I'm just gonna go find it. Am I still sharing my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Podfollow.com. So if you, when you create your podcast and you then add it to, so you then send it to Apple via RSS so that it's promoted on Apple Podcasts. You can then basically hook it up to Podfollow, and it creates for you. So if I go, hang on. So if I just go, just moving you around so I can use this. So if I go here, it sets up redirects for you. So you can tell it. So if God, it's a while since I've done this. So if somebody's joining on an iOS device, it automatically sends them to Apple Podcasts. Somebody's joining on an Android device, it automatically sends to Google. Desktop devices, it sends them to Spotify. Basically, you know how podcasting is really frustrating because you have to say, join us on Apple Podcasts by clicking here, join us on Spotify by clicking here, do this to do that to do the other thing. People who are unfamiliar with podcasts or who don't speak that language, it's much easier to be able to say to them, we're at podfollow.com/local0. Yeah, it's a bit like it's like Bitly. If you use Bitly in other contexts, you'll be familiar with the idea of link shortening. I'm just going to go back to my slideshow now. And it's free. It's completely free as well. And actually, if you enter your podcast into the British Podcast Awards, they will require you to do that via Podfollow. It's just a really handy tool. There are other equivalent tools. So I don't know if you host your podcast or the tool that you use to distribute your podcast. I use Captivate, which is a really smart tool. They have their own short link opportunity, but that's quite a useful one. I'm gonna skip ahead because I'm worried about time. Oh, there's Jim again talking about farming. There we are. So I mentioned Captivate. This is a screenshot that I took earlier of one of my podcasts. Captivate offers various, and I'm not here to plug Captivate, but that's the tool that we use to host and distribute our podcasts. Is everybody here familiar with podcast distribution tools? So Anchor, I know that Nico uses Anchor because you've shared that one with me, but essentially it's kind of the middleman tool that you send your podcast to, which then distributes it to Apple and Spotify and all the other places. Yeah, everybody here, just nod at me if that is making sense for you. Yeah. That tool will then give you various ways to share and promote your podcast. So this one, for instance, has this link here, the top one. You can put that into a tweet, and it effectively turns your tweet into a podcast player. Okay. Similarly, down below this, you can just copy and paste this code here into a web page, and again, it will convert that into a podcast player. So if you have, I know Scan has one, for instance, but wherever anybody has, again, to use the word I used earlier, online real estate, you can say to them, actually, would you like to have a podcast player of this that you could put on your web page? Because it can look really neat. Again, I'm going to just dot around here. I'll just show you. I was looking at Safari earlier. I'll just show you how we've got it set up on Local Zero, so you can just see how it can look. So this is the Local Zero page. Episodes here. So this is the most recent episode. You click into it, and do you see this here? This kind of square. That embed code pulls through to a website as a radio player that looks like that, and it's very easily done. You'd need absolutely minimal. Anybody who's using Wix or what they're called, WordPress or any of those things, it's basically a widget that plugs into those things, and it looks really neat at the other end, and it's all completely accessible from your podcast player. Other versions here, you can pull this bit of code through to a tweet, and you can pin that tweet to the top of your Twitter. Twit. Lots of twits in that sentence. And that will, so whenever you upload a new episode, that will automatically update so that your latest episode is pinned to the top of your, I'm using Twitter as an example, but you could do it. We're all moving to Mastodon now, aren't we? I don't understand Mastodon, but if you do, I'm sure it works fine there too. And similarly, you can embed on your website a widget that always has the most recent episode of your podcast. Yeah. So this is Captivate. Any and all of certainly the paid podcast tools will have an equivalent offer. Goodness me, I'm a bit worried about time now, so I'm going to rattle on. This is kind of the most. Oh, go on.
Just
yeah.
to check, I mean, would you be okay to sort of go overtime if need be?
I would. Yeah. Yeah.
Are people okay to stay a little bit longer if need be? Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll keep going to 2:15, something like that, because I want to leave time for you guys to ask questions as well.
Yeah.
Podcast marketing was the subject of the session, but I don't really like the word marketing. I prefer the word community building, because successful podcasting really is about working within and kind of for communities. If we were doing the kind of full version of this talk, the first half of it would be me banging on at you about how your podcast has to be valuable to people. Otherwise, you're not going to have an audience at all. Like, I do a lot of this stuff with kind of brands and organizations, with marketing teams and things like that. And the first thing I've got to sort of drill into them is that nobody's going to listen to an extended advert for their brand. So if you're creating a podcast, it has to be valuable to the people that you want to listen to it. Otherwise, why would they listen to it? So that's what building a community at its sort of basic level is. We've already talked about kind of encouraging people to recommend your podcast. Like, as I've said to you a few times now, like the first thing you need to do is make something that's worth recommending. Second, signpost to people that you would love it if they would recommend your podcast. Build it into your scripting. Say to them, so I make a podcast for Grazia, and we always include in the outro, it really helps us out if you share this podcast. People who support your podcast, we assume at least some of those will support your aims and ambitions in growing the podcast, and they will want to be helpful in that because they're part of your community. The trick is making them feel ever more part of your community, and to make them want more to do that work for you. And we'll talk about some ways to kind of empower them and make them feel like they're being active and being helpful. This quite woolly one here, second one on this list, activate your advocates. What does that even mean, Dave? Advocates in this context are the kind of powerful people around you who have lots of people's ears. So you saying you want, we've been saying throughout, we want people to recommend the podcast. I would suggest there are certain people who we really want to recommend the podcast. And I don't know who it is in your context. But for instance, Local Zero, the climate change podcast that we make, the people involved in that are from the University of Strathclyde, and the Vice Chancellor of the university very recently was saying very nice, glowing things about us on social media. Yeah, so it's the powerful people. If you can actually get into people's ears and say, you're a leader in this space, you're somebody who people trust, it would be really helpful. We would love it if you could share and support and promote our podcast. That can be a really powerful kind of tool and trick. I'm dotting around a little bit, but if you don't make transcripts for your podcasts yet, I would suggest that that's a really powerful thing to do as well. It makes your content very searchable. It means that when people are looking for whatever it is that you do online, they will, your podcast material would turn up in their search terms. It's increasingly important as well for accessibility, so that people who can't hear very well or have other kind of accessibility issues are also able to access the content that you that you're creating. If you're working for an organization, a larger organization, it's increasingly part of like, disability access legislation now that you kind of have to provide that stuff, but there are benefits to it regardless. I've mentioned encouraging social sharing. We, for a while on a couple of the podcasts, actually have been name checking people who share us on social media. So if you have people who are very supportive, call them out, like say nice things about them. Say thanks very much to, Gary in Aberdeen, who has been brilliant at talking about how much he loves our podcast. If you have particular groups in society that you want to reach, I wonder, Hazel, if this is the beginning of an answer to your earlier question. You're saying you want to reach people who don't care or don't have any interest in a particular topic. Could we super serve those people by bringing on hosts or developing a format that meets their needs or that interests them in some way? So, for example, there's a podcast called A Gay and a Non-Gay, and it's kind of built into their format that they have two people talking, one of whom is not engaged with a particular issue, and the other person is trying to win them over. So it's kind of, does it go back to the to the format that you're developing? Again, I want to have time at the end to sort of chat through some of these things. If you look bottom right, you'll see this sort of you might also like screenshot that I've taken. A really powerful tool, and this is where Casca might come in, is swapping and sharing. So mutually beneficial podcast swaps with other podcasts that are in your space. So, Casca sits at this sort of like a spider at the center of a web of climate engaged community podcasts. Could we have a sort of a swap where the host of one podcast goes as a guest on another podcast and talks a bit about what they offer and what they do, and maybe vice versa, the first person goes back on the other podcast? It's making arrangements that are mutually beneficial that kind of bring in more audiences. That can be a financial arrangement. You could buy space in somebody else's podcast, but it could also be, community building and sharing. It's worth having a look if you've got a podcast already. So Farmerama, for instance, Katie, if you don't already do this, it's worth looking at the You Might Also Like section at the bottom of the podcast, because the algorithm throws up content that is like your podcast. And it might be worth going to the people that make that and saying, listen, could we do something mutually beneficial to kind of share and grow our audiences? Because there's nobody in the world that only listens to one podcast.
That was in Apple Podcasts.
Apple, Spotify, yeah.
All of them have it.
Yeah, I think it's got to be a podcast with a fairly sizable audience already to make the algorithm work. But it's worth checking. And even if and that's just one example of where you'll find that You Might Also Like. Like you could just do Google searching. Like, for example, we make a podcast for an organization that's interested in internet safety and well-being for teachers. So we just did a Google search for podcasts that are aimed at teachers. And we're in the process of offering our podcast hosts out to them to basically say, they go on, they give a good account of themselves. They clearly know about the issues. They care about the issues. And the people listening to that other podcast go, do you know what? That person was quite interesting. And hopefully some of those people follow you back to your podcast as well. You remember me saying at the beginning, there's no silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. This is another example of something you can do. Go out and look for podcast of the week slots. Go out and look for people that will say nice things about your podcast. Whether it's in a trade magazine or like some sort of, I'm trying to think of an example in the kind of climate change arena. But, again, it's a little bit like that. Activate your advocates. Ashley Davis here does a weekly podcast of the week slot in the Times Scotland, I'm quite often in her DMs in a non-stalkery way, I promise, saying, listen, have you heard this podcast? We'd love you to review it, you know. There's a saying in Scotland, shy bairns get out. You know, you need to be quite upfront about your ask. And people don't mind. Like Ashley's always looking for ways to fill this column, you know, like it's helpful to her to have people like me making suggestions politely, you know. So podcasts of the week slots, getting people to do write-ups on their blogs. If they're influential people in your particular space or arena, ask them, have you thought about, your asylum seeker refugee stuff, Nico, you know, are there particular MSPs, for instance, who you could get to maybe do a series of tweets or something talking about the work that you do and the stories that you have? It's a by hook or by crook approach. We're getting to the end of the presentation bit, but I'm keen to leave time for afterwards as well. If you've never explored this, I really would suggest that you do, because it really makes people feel better about themselves. If you have a podcast that is getting 100 listeners in the week in which it's published, you are in the top 25% of all podcasts in terms of listenership. So if you're getting 101 listeners in the week that an episode is published to that episode, you're in the top tier almost of podcasting. If you're getting 29 listens per week, you're kind of middle of the road. I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing, Katie, that Farmerama is in the sort of top 5% mark, if not higher up. So, you know, that is in terms of, you don't need to share, don't need to tell us that. But if you're not, you could well be sitting there at home not understanding that, 900 listens to your podcast is actually really bloody good in the grand scheme of things. And if you're out there and you're looking for sponsorship and brand awareness, you can kind of shout that stuff to the rooftops. We are in the top 5% of podcasts. We are in the top 25% of podcasts. But the point the bigger point I would make to you is that podcasting is by definition a niche endeavor. Okay. I've made this point about how Newsbeat at lunchtime started off with 4 million listeners because we inherited them from the DJ that was on before. You start from zero, but what you also start with is an ability to really be useful within your specific niche. So the really trite example that I often give is if you make a podcast about people going to Mars, and the only two people that listen to your podcast are Richard Branson and Elon Musk, you've hit a really good percentage of your potential listeners. Okay, so if you're making like we make Local Zero, which is about local and community action to combat climate change, well, we're kind of pitching that at people who are active in their communities, people that are kind of making questionnaires, making surveys, trying to actively do things in there, people and researchers as well in academia. We don't have the whole of the UK as our potential audience. So for the potential audience that we do have, we do pretty well. So I started the session here saying that you need to build your marketing plan into your initial strategy and your development from the ground up. It's got to be part of your thinking from the ground up before you even hit record on episode 1. The other thing that you need to build into your strategy from day one is how you're going to measure the success of your podcast. Because if you're benchmarking yourself against, I need to update I always say Steve Wright in the afternoon, but he's not on anymore, is he? It's Scott Mills. So if you're benchmarking yourself against Scott Mills on Radio 2, you're doomed to fail. So start off by thinking about what is the total number of potential listeners you might have. And think about qualitative measures of success as well. So engagement, people that say nice things about you, reviews, online comments, conversions as well. So every time you're hearing somebody new is recommending your podcast to somebody else, that's a win. Every time your audience grows by one, it's somebody new who's having a deep and meaningful engagement with what you're doing. So again, as well as the marketing side of things, the how you benchmark what success looks like also needs to be done early on from the outset. So listen, that's very much a whistle through what we're about when we talk about podcast marketing. And I just wanted to say that I've got plenty of time, if we would sort of open it out for a chat, if you guys have got specific things that you want to, or if there's anything there that you want to revisit, just open it out now. Silence descends.
I'm quite interested, Dave, in the reviews, and like in theatre, it's been such an important thing. There's like certain reviewers that you look up to, but also it helps me to like find what I want to watch and what I want to listen to. Like, where does that exist in the podcast world?
Well, there are podcast of the week columns, as I said, and they're increasingly a thing in newspapers. There are big radio reviewers, in the kind of Guardian and the Times and that sort of thing. I would be sort of looking more, though, if particularly in kind of community and climate change stuff, I'd be looking at kind of opinion formers more generally rather than specifically reviewers. So, that activate your advocates thing I was talking about. It's who are those levers that you can kind of, and I know you do a community podcast in Porty as well, like in Edinburgh. Could you be looking at a partnership with influential people? My dog really wants to go out. Just 1 minute. Could you be looking at partnerships with kind of influential people locally? It's think about reviewers in a broader sense than just, somebody whose job it is to review podcasts.
Yeah, I suppose there's a BBC one that I got on once, which was like, they do short clips of your podcasts. And that was really good. And I was like wondering if there was more, something that was not written, that was people listening to different clips of different people's podcasts. Yeah, I was just saying, I know you do it a little bit on the Scan podcast. You tried a couple of times to do like short clips, but like a review show, basically.
Yeah, so I was trying to work out who's doing sort of climate engaged or related podcasting in Scotland when I first started. And we ran a few first episodes I put together. Actually, one of the first episodes was like a little collection of other people's stuff. And then I think we included a couple of like little excerpts from people and talking about why they're doing the podcast. But I've stopped doing that because it was a lot of work. But
something that I think is quite dangerous in podcasting is fracturing. So lots and lots of little community groups all over the shop, starting up little podcasts and preaching to the choir in some places and like not being findable at all. And I think one really practical thing that Scan can do to help that is you could be a hub. So you could so everybody would potentially have their own podcast feed on Anchor or whatever it might be, but they could also send their audio to you or even their RSS codes to you for you to have like a central feed that kind of collates and curates those offers.
So I've been trying to think of what is the technical, because not really had time to research it, the technical ways of doing it. I was very excited because the Australian podcasting community around climate had Climactic Network, which it was like I can't remember which provider they were with, but the guy, and it was free for him because he was working for them. So they basically could publish all these podcast channels on the same instance, and you basically could see everything in one space. And they also attach things like help files and sort of supporting each other in terms of technical support of how to do a podcast, and it was a good website and overarching organization. So he did a Skillshare with us, which is really interesting, and about how he set that up. But that's now disbanded because he moved an employer, and there wasn't anybody else to take it on, and there wasn't money to pay for it. But
a model that might be interesting to you is you'll be familiar with Radio 4's documentaries. So BBC Radio 4, there is no kind of overriding format. Like the documentaries are just kind of each one has its own individual format. And it can be quite tricky to market that in a podcast space, because like I said to you, if it's on the radio, people don't turn the radio off. But, in a podcast space, people quite like familiarity. They like hosts that they kind of know, and they like to, and it's, like Katie was saying earlier, you want to be able to recommend it to folks. Well, it's useful to be able to recommend something in kind of 15 words or less. It's, it's actually quite a useful exercise for creating a podcast format is, can I explain what my podcast is in 15 words or less? But what Radio 4 has done to get around that in the podcast space is it has what it calls the seriously strand. So it's essentially a home for all of the disparate types of audio documentary that exists on Radio 4, but in the podcast space. And all they've done is each week they take something interesting off the radio and they just top and tail it with a presenter. So they get a presenter to come on and say, hello, I am X stand-up comedian who you might have heard of off the telly. I'm presenting this week's Radio 4 Seriously. It's a brilliant look at roller derby this time or something. And so you have that familiar voice. So it could be Casca. Like, and what I'm saying is with you guys, you could basically have somebody saying, hello, welcome to the Scan. It could be the Scan podcast podium or something, podcast platform or something. This is the podcast where we, give a platform to the many, many people around Scotland that are providing community podcasts. This time we're focusing on Katie's podcast, which does X. We hope you enjoy it. And it's literally just, play the whole thing in full. And at the end of it, you say, we'll be back next week showcasing another podcast. If you want to listen to Katie's to the rest of, that, we hope you've enjoyed that snippet of, you'd play the episode in full. Hope you enjoyed that episode of Katie's podcast. Go find her on her feed. Yeah. And then you'd have a corresponding kind of website that also matches that up and has like a
collection,
almost like a pick and mix curation. Yeah. I think the most practical way you can help Casca is curation for sure. So what we've done with on Farm is a farming podcast that we make. Clues in the name, I suppose. So if I go to where is it? Collections. Can you see collections anywhere? Collections.
Yeah, there you go.
So we've got the podcast feed. There's like 100. There's like I don't know how many hundreds, dozens of on-farm podcasts there are now. But like within that, we've got say 8 episodes that talk about soil. Okay, so we've got this collection that we've pulled together here, which is essentially just all they're over here. All the collections that talk about soil in various capacities. Okay. And then it creates a collection feed for you. So let's say you've got dozens and dozens and dozens of disparate climate podcasts, but some of them are talking about carbon capture. Yeah. You want to make it easy for people to find the carbon capture podcasts, right? Because that's what they're interested in. And, so this is how it, it doesn't look that much fun, but this is the very, very basic way that it kind of presents all of the on-farm soil-related podcasts. And then if I go back, we've got collections on agritourism, environment.
That's within your publishing.
So within the podcast feed, you can then make kind of sub-feeds depending on the podcast provider that you've got, right? They don't all offer the same functionality. But the great, and again, I'm not sponsored by Captivate, but the great thing about Captivate is that if you have their kind of cheapest platform, cheapest monthly subscription, you get the same perks as if you're on their most expensive one. So, it's quite a good platform in that sense. Anyway, yeah, so you can, there's all sorts of things like that you can do. I'll stop sharing again now. So I hope that's been useful. I had my email there at the end. Nico's got his here as well. But if anybody wants to get in touch afterwards, just give me a shout. And particularly if you want to join the Scotland Audio Network, if you email me the email address that you want to be added to the Google group for that. I will just add you into there. And you can, be part of that kind of community of, it's about 100 now, kind of audio producers of various sort of levels, professional right through to sort of hobbyist, who are kind of sharing and sharing best practice and things that they love doing. So it's becoming quite a useful resource, I think.